Hey everybody, this is Pooch Van Druten, and
This is Chris Rabold, everybody. What's happening? Right here.
Which way are you? You're
right
this
here. Whichever way I am.
This way.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, it's episode 34 of Pooch and Rabold. Thanks for coming on down. It's been a little bit since Chris and I have talked, and he's been super busy. You've been out doing you did a gig in Houston, huh?
I did. I've been gigging. I'm doing my some of this. I've got a tagline for it now. I call it House of Worship Audio System and Mix Optimization.
Oh,
that's what we're calling, which is a fancy way. It's a fancy way of saying on-site consulting. Like, let's see what you got. Let's see where we can take it, and then go from there. Yeah. So,
thank goodness for the worship market, because we are both of us getting some opportunities to, try to help people in the worship market make their mixes sound better and their systems sound better.
They're the lucky ones. They're the ones working right now. I
know, right? And they it seemed like it hasn't changed much. They had to do some broadcast streaming, but at least around here in Texas, they're back to regular services. Like, people are showing up. So good for them, man, having some opportunities.
Absolutely.
I've seen some stuff around the web of some people getting, stuff here and there. There's some drive-in stuff and some broadcast things. People are doing that. So how was your consulting thing? How was it?
This particular one was great. I've done a few. This one was great. Shout out to my buddy BK Beard and John Mahoney out there. BK is actually with the church where I was at in Houston. It was great, man. It was great because we were essentially in the old Compact Center, It was in an arena, only that's been now dolled up to be, right. I don't want to say audio perfect, but it's pretty dang good. And it was cool. It was good. Real gear, real big system. Hadn't had a 20-box side rig in quite a while. Maybe not in all of 2020. Now that I think about it.
Did it sound really loud to you? That's what I'm concerned about when I go back to it.
We've talked about that. You know what? I got to be honest. Even when I go do stuff, there's another church here, that I talk about all the time. I mix with. I feel myself getting loud. I have a feeling you'll be louder before you know it. Like, it's kind of like riding a bike. Yeah. And that was a big thing of some of what we were doing there. As I was working up a mix, I would just be like, guys, I realize this is a little excessive right now. I realize I'm going to take it where I usually take it, and then we'll see where it really needs to sit, So, there's some of that. It's more like just when you're hearing, the big gnarly reflections and stuff. That's more of the troublesome thing, because you're like, oh, those don't exist in front of my near fields. It's like, that's more the reality of it. So, but it was a good time. I had a great time.
Was there a real band there, or were you doing playback tracks?
I personally worked on playback of the tracks, but we were fortunate that they do a couple tapings there a week. So I was able to see it translate actually with a couple different bands with each taping. So it was like, hey, let's work on tracks. Cool. The band's coming in tomorrow or the next day. Now let's see what happens. Okay, great. It translates, which just goes to show, you and I've talked about it before, where some people are really resistant to playback as though it's not the same source. And I'm like, no, it is the same source.
It is
to the one and the zero. It is the exact same source. Now, what might not be happening is the stage volume, but that source is the exact same. And sure as shit, we pulled it up, and guess what translated 1-to-1, because it's the same thing.
Exactly. And especially in House of Worship, they have good stage volume, right? They're trying to not blow a bunch of stuff into the first couple of rows, which happen to be the people in charge. So usually, in my experience, virtual playback in House of Worship is like exactly what you're going to get when, the guitar people. I've been to a bunch of places recently where even guitar amps weren't even on the stage. They were in some weird room. Guys using Kempers, and it's man, virtual playback is the tool, man. That's the way.
It is the tool. In fact, when people call and we'll be talking, and I'll just start talking and give them the spiel, and I'll be like, you are tracking, right? Because if they're not, we can still do it,
of course,
but it won't be the same.
No. You can't get nuanced with it at all.
Right.
You can't get into the details.
No.
You get the big picture, but you can't get the details.
True.
How was so? I did a bunch of consulting, and always, at least around here in Dallas, it's like there's 4 guitar players. Like, why is it the decision to always have 4 guitar players in house worship? I don't.
I know. That feels like country music too, where it's like, do we really need all of these and 2 acoustics? This particular setup was not. It was like, I was surprised. It was very. I did a couple churches actually. We did Lakewood in Houston, and then we did I think it was First Church in Pearland, and one had, neither of them, both of them actually only had 1 guitar, which I too was surprised, because I have found that more times than not that there was a lot. However, one had 6 vocalists and the other had 10.
Oh my goodness.
So, and so there's that, we talk on here a lot about opening up that vocal mic and everything going to shit, let alone when it's that times 10.
Then it's 10 of them.
So that was the challenge on all of those. But surprisingly, everybody sang really, really well. Everybody was on mic, so the bleed was like minimal. It was so refreshing to see. I kept waiting to pull one up that wasn't that, and it just never happened. Yeah. So it was really cool.
That's awesome. So all you guys out there, that's the best case scenarios when people are all on their mics. In house of worship, for me, 9 times out of 10, that's where you're going to find me speaking to a lot of musicians, because oftentimes in house of worship, there's some guys that are, volunteers, or, they auditioned for the part, but they're not really musicians. During the week, they do some other job, and maybe not have been taught well. And so I find myself with house of worship often on stage, watching a run through, and then going, instead of talking to the mixer about what's happening with his mix, immediately going to the stage and say, hey, come here with me. We need to go talk to some people, because, vocalist 1, 3, and 8 are, doing this stuff.
Yes. Right.
And, we've talked in a lot of these videos about how to handle that, and how to be nice, and how to be respectful, and do that well. But, you got to do that when that stuff's happening. You have to, no matter, you could have 14 plugins on an input with someone that's holding a microphone way out here, and it doesn't matter.
I tell vocalists all the time, not all the time. Let me rephrase that. When I have the opportunity to, and when I feel like I can say this, I'll say them, if they're a person who doesn't have good vocal mic technique, I'm like, right now you don't own that input. You have a timeshare with a number of other things going on in that input, but it's not you. Like, you don't even have 51% ownership of what the signal is in there. You're just a fraction of a bunch of noise that's going on,
That's right.
Hopefully if I say it the right way, they take it the right way, and they, it's kind of a challenge. It's like, own that thing, make that yours, So.
Yeah. And, know who you're speaking to. Like I said, if you're speaking to a volunteer and someone that really doesn't even know, they may not even know that that's the correct thing to do with a microphone, and so when I am coming upon someone like that, where I go, maybe they don't even know, the conversation is completely different, which is an explanation why, you know what I mean? So, holding the microphone closer, listen to, anyway, whatever. It's a long conversation, but it's something that you have to have, and something you have to do. So, not necessarily this weekend or whatever, the last week that you were doing your thing, but I've noticed, people hire both of us for consulting and send us mixes. I get a lot of people send me mixes and hire me to consult, to talk about what their mix sounds like. And what I've noticed is, even with all of this technology, a lot of the mixes that I get, there's some sort of disconnect that's happening in the overall big picture. So, for instance, I'll get a mix and like the drums will sound great, the bass guitar will sound great, the guitar sound great, the vocal sounds pretty good, but all together, there's no glue to it at all. It feels really disconnected. I always try to tell people, that what's coming out of your despite the fact that we're doing live, what's coming out of your console should sound like a record. And so some people, there are a lot of live guys out there that are kind of missing that. So I don't know, maybe we can talk about that a little bit. And like, what are some tips that you give to guys when you hear a mix like that? Like, what do you tell someone when you hear great sound, individual sounds sound great, but nothing like is glued together? What are some things that you tell people when you hear that?
It's funny because as you're saying it, my thought is if I'm conveying that to someone, I know what they want to hear after I say, however we would phrase it. Like you said, it's just it's not connected, or there's a disconnect. You know, it's disjointed. It's like this. I often say you end up with this, and because I will be guilty of this from time to time. This consortium of sounds. Like I present to you 12 things, but they're not. They are. Here's your 12 things. It's like the dating game. It's like no one can see one another, you know. And I know what they want the answer to be, and the way we're going to fix that is going to be with this plugin, and that's not the answer.
No, it's not.
And a lot of times I wonder, because I'm with you, I'm like, at this day and age, how are we still making those mixes? You know, like, why does it still, if anything, it sounds like there is no gear available to people. It's like,
I know,
you know what I'm saying?
So,
but you know that's not the problem.
It goes back to, sorry to interrupt you, but it goes back to when I first started mixing on, you know, live desks, when I didn't have any of these tools, you know what I mean? It's like, I was lucky if I had, you know, a PM 2000, you know, I was lucky if I had EQ and then maybe a couple of gates, but like, that was it. Right. And so then my mixes, there was no bus compression. There was no individual compression on channels, really. Maybe I had one or two compressors for like the lead vocal. But those mixes, when I recorded them back then, sounded a little bit like that, like a little bit disjointed and not together. And so in this day and age, when even a Behringer console, a Mackie console, you know, a really low end console, sorry, Behringer and Mackie, but a real low end console has tools on it that allow you to not have a mix sound like that. So that's what I'm trying to say is, like, in this day and age, why are mixes still sounding like that? Do you think?
I think it's got to be, it's one of two things. It is abuse of the overabundance of, you know, it's either an abuse of, you know, plugins or just strictly onboard. Like, I have seen that. You know what? I've seen that more times than not in some of these mixes this year in 2020, as we find ourselves working with others and critiquing others and helping others get better, and in turn helping ourselves get better. But I mean, I'm looking and it's like every tom is compressing 8 dB. Everything is like, not just touching compression, but it's getting smothered, you know? And
interesting.
So I think that does it, because that'll flatten it out quick, and that'll also make a bunch of, like, it'll just make a mess of everything if there's too much. I think it's either that, or I think something that we've spoken about here too is maybe just sort of a lack of a vision or a goal, you know, where you really, and I was there at a point in my career where maybe I don't know, like, I shot for certain things, but maybe collectively I just didn't know what I was going for. So in turn, if you can hear everything, you're like, okay, I'm good, when in fact you're not, you know?
That's interesting. And that always brings up the point, we've talked about it before on here. It's like, maybe people don't know what sounds good. You know, I think I really encourage you guys out there to find records that sound great. You know what I mean? Like, you know, unfortunately, you know, some of the records that are being released today, like, I wouldn't categorize them as great sounding records, unfortunately, you know? So find records that have dynamics and have, you know, maybe someone at the helm producing it that is a real artist, you know. But, you know, listen, like that Billie Eilish record that came out was amazing sounding. Like, there's amazing sounding stuff. So it has nothing to do with whether or not it's done in a bedroom or, you know, whatever. I'm just saying, you should study what a good record sounds like so that you can make your live mix sound like that record, right?
Right.
I mean, I think the key to my success has always been that I am like really good at emulating. Like I can listen to something and then say, okay, I want to make it sound like that. And getting there that's a whole other discussion, but it's always in my brain that is my goal. So what you were saying earlier about not having a vision, I think that's important, right?
Yeah, it is. Now I'll also say this, aside from working, I worked, came home for a second, and then, thanks COVID, I had an opportunity to, quick sidebar, I've never taken a vacation in my life. I told you this, we'll tell the listeners, never taken a vacation. I've never gone on a trip with the guys. I've never done anything because we've always been working, be careful what you wish.
You need,
I know. It's like, be careful what you wish for, I was just always working. So I had the ability to go hang out with some dudes this weekend. Everyone's tested. Everyone's COVID negative. We had the ability to get together, do this thing, blah, 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 blah. But while I'm there, I'm talking to these people, and they are normal people. They are not mixers. They're not in our world. And of course, people always have questions of curiosity. And one of my buddies who's like, he is a musician and he does care a lot. And like part of my musical upbringing was hanging out with this dude and listening to music. And I told him, I'm like, I think about you often when we do these interviews and you have to give your origin story. And I talk about how in high school, I started how to learn how to listen critically to a mix. And it was with this guy. And I was like, man, I've never told you this, but I'd tell this story all the time. And I always think of you. But I was telling him, because he's like, I mean, I don't know what sounds good. And I'm like, yes, you do. Yes, you do. And I'm like, some people more than not. And even to the lay person, they know, does this sound good? Like, does that sound good?
Of course.
I'm like, and then just take that up the varying levels of what you're able to perceive. And I said, but I'll tell you this, there is no light that goes off when it sounds good. Like you have to be the barometer. And that is tough. Even when you have, because you and I have very clear visions, yet I will sometimes go, is that it? Are we there?
Well, it's never done, right? But that is the perfectionism in us. But there is a level that I get to where I go, okay, everything is kind of all working together, and this is sounding pretty good. But that one little stupid sound and playback is driving me crazy. So that is a level of saying, hey, I've gotten there. But you're right. It is never the same. But did you and your buddy, when you were in high school, I'm just curious, did you guys ever discuss about sound? Like, would you listen to records together and be
it was more like listen to, because for the longest time, I just heard music as music. And I've said it 100 times, I could kind of play a few things, but I was by no means a musician. And, if it wasn't, I don't know, maybe there was times when there was like a big barrage of sound and what I thought was maybe the guitar was actually being done by the bass. And that with this guy, I don't know why, it was just the way we would listen. We would hang out and take our brains to places where they would go, as youth do.
Yes.
And you're really listening deep to music. And I'm like, oh, wow, I never realized that was a this, or that was a this. Or maybe it was instrumentation that I wasn't familiar with, like certain keyboards that I didn't know what they were. Right. And to me, it was just, that sound that happens there. And he'd be like, oh, well, that's a this or a that. So it was more like we weren't trying to get audio geeked. We were just, kind of, now that I look back on it, I realize how formative that was.
For sure. Like if I look back on the same thing, my best friend, I'm still friends with him now. And we grew up together since I was 3 years old. And he's a Nevada highway patrolman. Nice. So he doesn't know anything about music. However, when we were in high school, we would sit there and talk about, like he would get the new Cars record and be like, dude, check out this keyboard part, or man, those drums sound killer, and those were discussion, or like, I remember specifically that Genesis, that Phil Collins record, In the Air Tonight, that big drum
of course
thing with the flange and the huge room and it's a iconic sound. But I just remember like us being, I don't remember how old I was, probably 14 or something, or 15. And smoking a joint and just being like,
absolutely,
holy crap, that is the most amazing sound. So the reason I asked you is that that dude who is now a sergeant in Nevada Highway Patrol actually shaped what I do now. You know what I mean? Like, and what I listen to. I mean, I got to tell you, like, my snare drums are the Cars.
No, absolutely. 100%. I've said on here before, I don't know if I've said it on here, but I've talked to it a bunch of times. I'm a kid of the 80s and but I wasn't in my friend's rehearsal. I wasn't rehearsing with my friends in band practice. So like Mutt Lange drums, like I didn't know drums didn't sound like that. I've said that before and I say it all the time because it's true for every sample machine. I just thought those were drums. So I too aspire for the Lindrum snare, which is not even a real drum.
I know, but the tone of it and the way that it fits in all of it is what was so amazing to me. We always talk about how nobody comes to hear the snare drum, but I think both you and I know how important the snare drum is in a forward way in the mix. It's another thing that I've noticed about people sending me mixes that like the drums maybe sound right, but the snare drum is not in the same. It's like it's not even in the same room with the rest of the drums.
Right.
You stand in front of an acoustic drum kit and the snare drum is the loudest thing that's happening. Yeah. It doesn't matter who the drummer is. Even if they're hitting lightly, the snare drum is always the loudest thing. So whenever I create a drum mix, I am taking that into account. The snare drum is the loudest thing in all of my mixes for sure, in regards to just drums. And then figuring out where that snare drum lies with everything else, I think is a real skill, don't you?
Absolutely. And that's why it's super hard. That's why, mixing drums is that's just such a beast because you have to make those decisions. Like what's leading the way, but not leading the way too far that it leaves everything behind, because in theory, that is one instrument. I think that's another thing too. We talk about like overuse of available, let's just say DSP, whether it's in plug-in or onboard processing or this or that. As often as people ask us, and as often as we talk about parallel processing, I think there's a giant abuse of that going on that lends itself to that flat, I call them flat drums, that really flat sound. It's just like, what is that? It's just like, that doesn't sound right. I think that's it. I think that's at play a bunch too.
What's interesting is that before we started talking, before you started saying that, I was going totally in the other direction. I was like, some of these mixes sound so disjointed because people aren't using bus compression and aren't kind of gluing things together. But I think you're right. I think that now that I think about it and listen to it in that thought process, I think that's it. I think people are overusing some of these tools.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have thought that before had I not been consulting and seeing so many people's mixes.
True, me either. But what I'm saying is what I heard and thought of as too simplistic and not using bus compression truly was over compress things so that they felt disjointed. Now that I really think about it. So that's probably what's happening.
It's weird. It's funny that like two things, the one being just, no bus processing, what am I trying to say here? No parallel, as it pertains to like a rhythm section is one sound, yet the extreme kind of replicates that sound. It too sounds, when you use too much of it, it starts to sound really small,
It does.
And it loses all its punch. Weren't we talking on here about when certain things get hit hard enough or limited enough, they kind of go backwards?
Yeah, totally.
And that's it. Because
a timbre change and it destroys, because of harmonic distortion or whatever, destroys the sound of what's happening. It's crazy. I just think I don't know how to teach someone this. Do you? Like, besides like go listen to records where it sounds good and try to replicate it, because that's how I learned, I think. Listening to my favorite records and being like, well, that sounds amazing. I want to be able to have my mix sound like that. And then a lot of experimentation, you know what I mean? Like that's how I got to where I am, I think. So how do you teach this? What do you think?
my experience has been you quickly learn with someone, oh, they're trying, they just haven't put it together, or oh, they're trying and they're not going to put it together. In other words, you know what I mean? And at that point, you just keep talking until the clock runs out, and you just be of best of service as you can to them. And you try to give, and you know how it is when we consult. I mean, at least for me, I will tell you exactly what I would do. I won't like beat around. I mean, if you're paying me for my time and my whatever input, I will tell you exactly what I would do. And that also means, here, take this and run with it, you know? And so, it was when it's clear they're not going to get it, you're just giving them free shit, and they just get to
I know.
I
mean, I've said it on here before, and we've talked about it. It's there comes to a point where I can teach a lot about the skills of how to get there, but there comes a time when I can look at a guy or a girl and just be like, they just don't have the thing. And this is kind of part of that. This is like the advanced end part of, like, if you can get all this stuff to sound pretty good individually, then you're doing a great job. And this is like I don't know, it's like something that is inherent in you or it isn't, right?
Yes. You know what's funny, as we're talking about this, so I went to that trip this weekend. I rode with a buddy of mine who lives here in Athens, Georgia. And we're in his car, and I'm like, hey man, because there is a mix for something I've been working on. I'm like, can we check? And I checked it in my car, and I wanted to check it in somebody else's car. I was like, can we check this mix? And I compared it to another mix that had been done for the band in a similar regard. And you know what? I like the other mix better. And I had that moment of like, oh, but I tried. And then I had that moment of like, damn, how I'm missing the mark. What am I doing wrong? You know? And I started in my own mind blaming it on, mixing in here, which is not at all, soundproofed in any way. And I was like, yeah, but you put your cans on. Like, come on, Chris, you just missed. He just beat you. So, but we're talking about small margins here. Dude,
sometimes you can't beat it. Like, I have had literally probably 3 times in my career where a rough mix was better than something that we worked on for years and. Not years, but I mean, months in a studio. Right. There's a famous story about Clive Davis. Hearing that Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You for the first time. And he was sent a rough mix, a rough DAT I'm blanking on who's the famous producer that produced that song?
I honestly don't know who produced that.
Oh, man. I could see his face. Anyway, he was married to a Beverly Hills housewife. Whatever's on that show. My wife watches that Beverly Hills show. Yeah. Anyway, major producer dude, right? Puts a real quick rough mix together, puts it on a DAT, ships it to him in New York. Clive Davis says he loves it. This is amazing. Thank you. This is great. And then that producer proceeds to spend the next 2 weeks building a mix at, Capitol in LA, spending 16 hours a day for 2 weeks straight to mix this one song, because it was the song that was going to be on that movie, Bodyguard movie. And he sends him that mix, sends that to Clive Davis, and he hates it.
Oh, rough.
And, in the end, they had a full on, they MF'd each other on the phone, like, screw you, screw you, screw you. And in the end, the song that you hear, I Will Always Love You, is
no way. That's the rough.
That is the rough.
No way.
Yep.
Wow. That's an amazing sounding rough.
Yep.
Wow. That's crazy. Yeah, no, I didn't know that.
It's a really funny story.
Yeah. But I don't, just with this whole topic in general, I'll tell you another reason why I think we find disjointed mixes now, which what we're talking about here is like, we want to hear a musical mix. We want to hear a musical mix that everything's kind of holding hands together in the right way. Another thing too that's going on is, I think some artier people, I can't remember which one's the creative side, the left brain or the right brain, but whichever side of the brain that is, those side brain people are getting shoved out in a lot of places audio wise, and the techier people are getting in because they're more interested in setting up the console and in wiring the network and in doing this. So we're getting a lot more tech-minded people in artistic roles. That sounds so damning, and I'm sorry, folks, if you just realized you fall under that heading. But yeah, God, I mean this in the best way. I'm just saying, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So you're essentially getting the AV guy. You're getting the AV guy that is now in the mixer role.
Yeah.
More so than the mixer that's in the mixer role. And so we're getting mixes that sound like that.
Yeah, I think that has the entire industry has shifted to that. You know, there used to be a true artistry in being a producer or a an engineer. There was years and years of experience and watching, being watching the best do their thing. I came up in watching some of the best engineers in the world do their thing, and I learned from them, and now it's all weirdly disjointed, right? Like people are they bought a laptop and some Pro Tools, and now you got on YouTube and now you're a mixer. And so I think, unfortunately, and I hate to sound like the old fuddy-dud, but it's like I think some of the artistry has been lost, and that's why I keep saying, like, go back and listen to records that have that artistry on them. It's interesting, as I was just talking, I remembered this weekend I watched on Netflix right now, there's an Alicia Keys songwriters thing. It's like 30 minutes long, and it's her talking about writing a song with a couple of other songwriters. And in it, they kind of break the mix down and show some components that are in it. And you guys should all go check that out, because there's some stuff in the mix that is like felt stuff, like real low, loopy stuff that's definitely in there. Like, when you listen to the overall picture, you can just barely pick it out. But without it being there, and there's a couple examples that she shows, without that piece of that mix being there and in the right place, the mix just doesn't work. So maybe that is something that you guys can go check out and see kind of what we're talking about. It's like there's important components to your mix that help it to make it, be something amazing.
And as you were speaking, or just a second ago, I started thinking, I'm like, well, we should like try to work towards an answer too. I think we're dissecting. I'm glad you came back around to that. So what does make a good mix is essentially where we're headed. We talk about how easy it is, or how common it is, maybe because it is easy to make a disjointed mix. But a thing to me that allows, and it's the hardest thing, the thing to me that okay, guys, so then what does make the mix work better? I think it has so much to do with the bass guitar and the low end in general, because it is way easy when we talk about these little individual pieces of this mix that don't have anything to do with one another. If you plop them on this bass, suddenly they kind of represent, they're just more, they're sitting on something, and they have they're not just floating in space on their own. But it's hard. And of course we got to realize, listening to board tapes too, if the bass, it's so hard if the bass is too loud, from the stage, and you're carving around it or this and that. But that to me is a way to kind of, well, how do you make it gel? Well, get the low end to gel first. Get the low end to gel.
I think that's great advice.
Then you can plant all these individual items. Then we can work on smearing them together. Then we can start working on reverb or more distortion or compression or these sorts of things. So,
one of my professors at Berklee College of Music used to talk about a mix conceptually, and a mix being a potted plant, a potted flower, and that, the guitars and the vocals and, all this stuff that you're talking about is the flower part of the plant. But that part can't be there without the bass, without the bass and the roots of it.
That's excellent.
of that plant, there's not going to be any flowers.
Right.
So get the roots part right and the bottom part of the plant right, and then the rest of it, makes it. So I think you're absolutely right that the low end is an important factor for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I was trying to think what other advice we could give. I think that maybe some people don't conceptually really grasp every instrument. I make compromises in the overall sound of individual instruments in order for everything to work. So for instance, if you were to solo up one of my guitars by itself, it might not sound all that great. You know what I mean? It might be kind of, maybe some of the low end is missing, whatever it is. You solo it up and it is definitely like, we would be like, that's not a great guitar tone. But in the midst of all of it is what it works. And so I think people miss that. Like they try to make every single individual instrument sound great and then throw it all together on the master bus.
Yes.
And that just doesn't work. So it's the compromise part that I think people miss. Is that something that's definitely something you do, right?
Yeah, and I think that too would be maybe an abuse. Of course, we talk a lot about soloing because we do solo, but we'll solo with purpose.
Yeah.
I think that too is maybe, if you're building with the advent of tracking now, specifically, you go back and listen. Well, if you sit there and you're just pulling up one thing at a time and you're making it gargantuan, that's not a mix because you can't put all those together. It's going to fall apart. So listening in context is so incredibly important. I too know that feeling of, it's almost like if you do, if I line every now and again, I'll line check in the PA. It's usually all just in cans for reasons we talked about. But if I do pull it up, there's some inputs and I pull it up and I'm just like, I know this doesn't sound that great on its own.
I know.
But I know in context. And again, that's what I was talking about with my buddy going back in the day, where I couldn't pick out sometimes, where if I heard a big strum on a guitar, well, what really made all the power in the mix was the accompanying note of the bass guitar.
Exactly.
And and that's what I was saying. As a kid, I didn't know how to pick those out, or I was just learning how to pick them out. And as a mixer, you need to know how to do that. So for instance, if that's happening, I'm with you, man. My guitars will get high passed so that the bass guitar has a place to live.
Totally.
But knowing that they're going to work in conjunction together, So yes, I think that's probably a big part of it is listening in solo too much and then just expecting it all to fit together,
Yeah. I think of it too, just if this helps anybody, sometimes I think of what's happening like mixing paint. So if you take a really neon blue and a really neon green and mix them together, you end up with this horrible brown. You know what I mean? So it's subtlety of the paint when mixed together makes an amazing color, right? So it's not about the individual colors. It's about when you're mixing stuff together, you're shooting for that incredible color when the 32 colors get mixed together.
Right.
That's really kind of what I think in my brain conceptually, it's weird. I think color, I don't know why. Maybe I love to draw, so maybe that's it. But like, I'll look at a guitar and think of it as, well, I need to make that, I hate this. I'm going to say this and people are going to go, oh, like what? Like Van Halen? But no, I think of and look at a guitar and be like, oh, that needs to be a bit more brown, if that means something. You know what I mean? It needs to be a bit more low passed, all the brightness out of it, and high passed up, to make some space for the bass guitar. And so that's how I think about that, is that color needs to be dull or whatever.
Yes.
I'm just trying to give people examples of kind of what's going on in our head when we're doing stuff. But the hard part is like what we talked about before. I have been in many situations where I have been mixing, I've touched something, done something, and someone that was watching me will say, wow, that fixed like everything. All of a sudden the mix came together. How did you know to do that? And my answer, like 9 times out of 10, is like, I don't know how I knew to do that. I just knew that it needed that. And so that is, that's the hardest thing to teach. How do you teach someone that?
Yes. Yeah. You know, I have a friend who recently she's, you know, we talk about work, this or that. And she's like, you know, I still don't know what you do. I don't understand. and particularly now I'm like, yeah, cause I don't do it anymore, but it's clearly
so awesome.
we do. I know, but I'm like, well, put it this way. Like I have a bunch of ingredients and I have to like cook a meal that is like pleasing and palatable and maybe even very enjoyable, you know? And it's like, everyone can get that. I'm like, if there is too much paprika in anything, it's all wrong. It's all wrong. It only takes too much of one of those. Yeah, I'm like, true. But it's finding the balance in all of those. And I'm like, but I do it on like a musical level with musical instruments. Does that kind of make sense? And she's like, oh yeah, no, it does. Yeah. And again, we got to remember we're talking about a mix, not a presentation of sounds. You know, it's not a parade of sounds. It is a mixture of sounds. And that mix is supposed to equal music. We forget that. We're so mix driven. No, we're supposed to be making music with the mix, for sure. You know? So, but it's a tough one, man. I don't know that everyone is supposed to be able to get it. If they could, it wouldn't be, you know.
That's true. I mean, there is artistry to this. And so, I mean, but we're trying to get people to get the best that they can out of, you know, out of themselves. Really, and achieve something that most people think sounds good. So I don't know, try all those things. But I think when you mix, have that in the forefront of your brain of like, okay, yeah, my drums sound great and my bass sounds great and my guitar sounds great, but when I put them all together, it's kind of just okay. Well, that's not okay. Like figure it out. Like figure out, you know, how to dull up the guitar or emphasize the whatever in the drums to make all of that work, you know?
And you said it earlier. I was happy to hear you say the word compromise. I mean, it really is.
It is a compromise.
You make compromise because you're not getting graded on those individual elements. Again, you're getting creative on the whole output.
Yeah. So definitely. Cool. One other subject that a lot of people are still, whenever I consult with them, are like, I just got a DM from a guy that hired me, wanted me to explain to him why I don't mix subs on and aux. And so I know we've addressed this and I know we've talked about it, but the question keeps coming up.
I know.
And so I don't know how to be more clear about, you know, both of ours opinion about that. You know, neither one of us mix subs on an aux, and there's a few reasons why. Chris, why don't you kick off reason number one, and I'll take it from there. How about that?
I mean, I think, and maybe reason number one, it might change every time this has come up, really, but it's like the first thing I think is I just mix. Like just mix. And in just mix, what I mean by that is if you're having to think about the subs on an aux thing all the time, that's pulling you out of.
You're thinking about subs in a disjointed kind of a way.
And as if they're this separate. So what this causes you to do though, is to have to backtrack and to look at the system, you know, a little heavier. So we want it where we know the system, we trust in the system, and that when I pull an input up, I just shape it tonally as I need to. I don't also think in this like damage control way of subs on an aux. And some people will say, well, and then they're quickly going to pour in with all the reasons. Well, nothing ensures, you know, less low-end, unneeded, low-end frequency content where it shouldn't be, blah, 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 blah.
That is a complete bullshit statement.
It's too much, guys. It's too much. And there's a reason that if you ask the majority of, and I don't even want to say higher end mixers, but maybe really good mixers that you know, that they probably don't do it. You know, I don't know. Like, I'm not even giving you an answer. It's because I'm so tired of answering the question is why. That's why.
I know, but we have to keep answering it because people keep asking us. You know what I mean? I don't know if it's that they haven't seen our previous videos or whatever. But listen, guys. All right, there are some technical reasons why not to do it. All right. Yes. One of them is,
and we can get into those.
Yeah. One of them is that if you are sending stuff from individual channels, depending on what plugins you have on those individual channels, the latency of those channels are different. So now there's all this time stuff that you're messing with when you're coming from individual sourced sub-send, as opposed to a all aligned mix that is then sent to left, right, and sub. That's aligned, and they're all in a line before you even talk about making sure that the subs are in line with the system. I'm talking about your mix being in full alignment. If you are sourcing your stuff from individual channels, you're not doing that. You're playing with phase.
Right.
And so that alone makes me not want to do it.
Right.
The part of the other, examples of why not to do it are, from my perspective, I use subs as an extension. Okay. So they're an extension of the already in the low end part of the PA. And I like some things to kind of just touch that crossover point so that they're in the low end of the PA, but they're also just a little bit in the sub. And the only way to do that is with a high pass filter. You cannot decide to send only a little bit of the snare drum
at a good point
at full EQ, a full EQ'd send of it, if you know what I mean. With the high pass filter, I can just let it scooch a little bit into the sub. And, for instance, like a snare drum, sometimes the bottom of a snare drum, I let scooch into a 60 hertz crossed over sub. So it gets a little bit of that 50 sometimes if it needs it, if it needs that. The bottoms of guitars, getting that crossover point and getting the bass guitar right is managed oftentimes with a high pass filter. I almost always never take a bass guitar and not have some sort of high pass filtering going on. And remember, guys, this is a high pass filter it's not a brick wall filter.
It's not infinite, not even at 24 or 48. No.
Exactly. So you are allowing frequencies past the crossover point to happen. So when it says 63 on your high pass filter, there's still 50, 40, maybe even a little bit of 30, it just depends on whatever the filter is. So anyway, those are two examples from my perspective.
Well, and I just, as you're talking, because I realized my answer was such a poopy pants, like, God, just shut up, just don't do it. But, which is not an answer.
True, though.
It's true.
I want to scream at people. Don't.
It's just 6 months into explaining this, or just do it and quit asking and expecting me to, like, I'm not going to validate just do it. Yeah. And if it works, then I'm not telling you you're wrong.
That's true. Listen,
yeah.
I mean, hey, if you get a good result, I don't care how you get there.
And
that's
I really
the truth.
Don't care. And in fact, one of the mixes that I heard most recently on an on-site consulting thing, he had subs on an aux, but he did it in the grown-up way, in that they were all derived from like groups and things. Okay. However, in doing that, so he did it that way, right? Which means it was essentially the same as not doing subs at all. And they were all at 0, because subs on an aux can mean a number of things. It can mean when I want the sub sourced from this whatever individual input, it's at 0. Like there's no variable. Then there's the guys that have like 0, -12. Well, I only put a little of my time.
That's what I'm talking about.
I know. And it's that. All of that is just too much. And here's the deal too. It ropes you into, it puts you in a corner. Because let's say you've got your drums and they're just drums. They don't go in any buses. They just all go to the left, right. Cool. Send your subs from those individual channels, whatever they might be. What happens then on the day that you decide, you know what, man, I'm going to start grouping some stuff, or I'm going to get into some parallel stuff. It's just another step that you have to unwind and that's what you were saying. Because now if I'm sending my kick if I'm sending the subs from kick one,
it's not getting the bus compression.
Kick one is now out of time over here, and it's all going at one time. This is going another time. The shit's smeared. It's all lost, you know? Yeah. And now you can know that, and you know to step out of it and to work your way out of it. But it's almost just like, why? You know, why
so much more work? Like, I don't, you know.
And we talk about mixing records and stuff. Like, if on the best way you can have it as a live mixer is that where you really do just walk in and mix as though you're in the studio, and no one's printing a sub bus in the studio, you know. And again, not that we have to do whatever they do, but there's a reason, because they're just mixing music. And we have so many things in our world that kind of aren't mixer-esque. It's nice when we get to do the things that are mixer-esque. So quit wasting your time on all these other things that are just, it's just too much, you know.
It's funny that you said that, because I had a guy recently that DM'd me about that, like asking me how to, he's like, I have, you know, subs on and aux. How do I get that same bus compression that I have of the parallel compression of the drums? And like, my answer was, you don't. And for guys that are, and I got to be honest, y'all are the favorite that are watching on here are the people that you're not working on SD7s. You're not working on PM whatevers or L500s or S6Ls. You're working on blah, 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 blah. Does blah, 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 blah have the ability to send from a group to a sub or to a, probably not. Probably not.
So quit, whoever told you, or stick with it. One of the two, you know. But
and my argument is to get to know high pass filters and make them your friend.
Yeah.
And you will actually discover that you know, this argument about how, you know, sub information is so much cleaner if you send it from individual channels will go out the window.
It will.
Once you understand how high pass filters work and how you can control that crossover point between sub and low end of the PA using high pass filters, right?
Yeah. And also at the end of the day, like whatever your gold standard shows that you've heard in your life that were done, particularly nowadays, if you're, I don't know, whatever, let's just say you're dialed in, you go see modern shows, like large scale shows, you know, you're probably not hearing subs on and aux on those shows. You know what I'm saying? And was there any part of you that went, ooh, there's some bit of sub information that no, you did not, because they were a good mixer that knew how to use high pass filters and they had a good system that was properly tuned, you know? So,
and even having said that, the other direction, even if you have the worst tools in the world, you know, a 4-channel mixer and PA on a stick with a single sub, I would still argue with you that you will get a better result by not trying to send individual channels to the sub.
Now, that being said, I can't think of anything worse than if you were stuck. Now I'm thinking about consoles of yesteryear, like we did on one, but we still pulled it off then, you know, where there was like a 60 hertz or maybe an 80 hertz engaged 12 dB per octave. I mean, that is asking for it, but that's when you get into like, well, then use the low shelf on your EQ, you know, like,
in combination, I would do that a lot.
Yes.
You know, the low shelf part of it and the high pass filter
and the high pass
to get that curve. Yeah.
Right.
Land.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, guys, we're, you know, if it works for you, then cool. But, you know, you asking me to tell you that it's cool,
right?
Like, I know I'm not going to say it's cool because it's not what I do. But I mean, hey, if it works for you, then great.
Right.
So since we've been kind of talking about, you know, our experiences with, you know, people hiring us to consult on their things, you know, we're coming to the end here, but let's talk a little bit about, you know, when we consult, when you and I consult, we not only ask for the board mix or the left and right of whatever they have going on, but we ask them for their file to kind of look and see if we see something weird. What are some things that you've noticed?
Yep, I get you here. I got you. Yes, I already know where you're going with this. I will see a lot of times where, okay, we're talking about a mix here. And in fact, I just mentioned this, we're just talking a second ago about subs on and aux. And I said, we've got so many other things going on that kind of take us out of art mode, relish in the fact that you can just be a mixer, right? And so one thing I'll see is I'll start noticing that every input is cut really heavy right around 2K. or something like that. And what that needs to tell you, what you need to start to learn how to look, it's almost like when you took a test as a kid and you're like, yeah, there's no way they could all be C. You know, you're aware something is wrong, right?
Yes.
So be aware something's wrong when you've cut every single input at 2K. And what that means is there is a problem upstream or downstream, depending on how you look at it. There's a problem system-wide. Yes. And actually be kind of happy about that, because what that means is if I correct this on the system end, then I can put all this back, and that band of EQ can now maybe be used in a more creative way as opposed to like a damage control sort of thing.
And so less phase shift over individual instruments over, what's going
totally. On. Yeah. Particularly if you're applying all that EQ to that. That's a great point. If you're applying all of that EQ over and over and over and over and over again to various degrees, it's just, there's so much phase smear at that point. That's a fantastic point. So the answer to that is that basically what I'm seeing a lot, and it sounds like you have too, is I'll see where there's clearly a system problem, because otherwise there's no reason every input needs to be cut at 890 hertz over and over and over and over again. Yeah. So start to learn, look around, be skeptical, or just be observant. Be like, should I do that everywhere? Probably not, so there's probably a reason. So again, know that we're working in a world where there's two worlds here. There's the PA and there's the mix. We want to make sure they're both great, so they meet together. Off they go, and then we get to just mix, which is the whole point of this. It should be the most fun part of all of this, is the mixing part,
Yeah, that's right.
You see that? You see the comment, like you see where stuff's cut way too much?
Absolutely. What I always say is if you see extremes happening with anything, compression, EQ, whatever, if you are having to take a device to its extreme, then usually there's something wrong, and it leads me to investigate. So when someone sends me a file, where there's like weird boosts and like whole shelves of high-end cranked 12 dB, and whatever, a dynamic compressor, I mean, buried, threshold all the way up. I start to say there's something wrong here, and it may be the system, maybe that individual input, something's wrong. Like maybe it's a DI that's gone bad. So there's no high end happening in that DI. And instead of changing the DI out, you have this shelf at 4K at 12 dB to try to make up, the high end. I always tell people, it's like, if you are having to do extremes, then for me, I always investigate. When I have to do something that's extreme, then I go, something's not right. Let's figure out what's happening. Yeah. Whatever that is, move the microphone, check the DI, maybe the line is half line, all of those things. So whenever I see that in a file, definitely there's something.
High gains make a little alert go off for me too. Like if I see gains that are at 3 o'clock or greater, I'm like, something's not right there. Either they're giving you low level, that in turn you're cranking it up and it's going to be noisy, or like you said, it's half line. I don't know that, but one legged, or it's it's something like that. It's whenever we're doing line check or we're starting with inputs. If I have that gain knob starts creeping, once it gets past about 1 o'clock, I start getting worried, because once we get to like 3 o'clock, what happens when it corrects? Then that shit is, that's 20 dB louder or something. So, look for these things, and also look for, if let's say your monitor sends, like you're running front of house, you're running monitors from front of house, and all of those monitor sends are at like plus 12. I just can't get it. Something's wrong somewhere.
Something is wrong. Yeah.
Your gain staging somewhere is off. We should exist everything should live in a pretty logical place,
But what you brought up is an interesting thing. There is kind of a compromise, the compromise word again. When you are mixing monitors from front of house, oftentimes I find that the overall individual gain for me is a little bit hotter. And then to make it right at front of house, a lot of times I'll have to turn some busing down from 0 to, like -3. To make it work in front of house, but have the right gains for the sends to monitors. There's kind of there's a delicate balance there that I find, I have to mess with. But what we're talking about is extremes, right?
Yes.
Like you said, 3 o'clock gain is like something's up.
Right. And particularly like repeated, like consistent, like there's a lot of extremes everywhere. You've done it time and time and time again.
An individual input, you might be like, oh, maybe it is that way. But
that's my weird one.
Yeah. If the whole desk is showing that trend, then something's up.
Someone I was again, go back to, I'm glad that my vacation could come up so often, but we're driving.
Well, you took a vacation for the very first time.
I did. So now I'm talking about it. So we're driving back today, and my buddy, I think we were talking about relationships, and I was basically just saying, and I quickly made some comparison to our world, and what it was like when you go see a show, a lot of people will be like, well, how'd it sound? How'd it sound? How'd it sound? And I hope that I can be like, man, awesome. Or, you know what? Really good. But a lot of times my answer, and I mean this, I'm not just being polite or being kind of a little snooty, with a little preface, but I'm like, well, I wasn't the one driving, and I basically was saying it's the same way in relationships. Like, it's hard to judge someone else's relationship because unless you're in it, you don't know. And it's the same way with show files. Or if or someone's mix as a whole, you don't really know until you get you need more information. I need more information. Totally. And that's something like in this situation where it'd be like, hey, have you noticed that you're doing this time and time again? If they have noticed and they haven't done anything about it, then they should have maybe been more aware. But if not, then it's kind of like an aha moment. Like, oh, wow. Yeah, no, I've been so in the thick of it. I lost reference and I didn't realize I was doing that everywhere. So it's easy for these mistakes to happen, for them to creep up on.
I think especially, you and I during this time, most of the consulting that we're doing is House of Worship. So people are sending us files from House of Worship, and think about that. There maybe is a guy that sits there every Sunday and he's been working on that file, digging into that file for years, maybe, and so he or she may have dug themselves a hole that they're not aware that they've dug. And so that's when I feel particularly glad that I can help them and point those little things out, be like, oh, have you noticed the trend of this, over what's happening? So those are all things that you guys can all look, in your own mixes and evaluate in your own way. Maybe try to step out of the mixer role for a second and kind of look at the big picture of what's happening and be like, oh man, I have gone down this hole.
I've been in this hole for
I've been in this hole and I need to get out of it. And
that is the benefit.
We talked about that before. It's like, there are some times where, I've gone back in time 2 months ago in shows because I have for 2 months buried myself in shows. So we do it too.
Yeah. And it's the benefit of outside observation.
Yep.
If somebody coming in and go, oh no, you're crushing it, man, but blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, I never noticed that. So.
Well, I think we've run out of time. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Hopefully, we just gave away all our secrets that we charge for. So,
yeah, great, good one, guys.
Great. No, I mean, hopefully, you're able to gain a bunch of knowledge from those things, and thanks a lot for tuning in. Hey, don't forget to contact your local representatives about our industry. Unfortunately, the Restart Act was not included in the latest kind of release of money or voting about money in Congress. The restart part of that, which would have focused on our part of our industry, did not get included. So again, we're being ignored. Our 11 million of us are being ignored. And I think the only way is to just keep hitting your local representatives. Pretty much on a weekly basis, I send an email to my local representatives going, help, we need help. And hopefully you guys are staying safe and we can get through this, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for tuning in.
See you, everybody.